What's up, y'all? Welcome to Blades and Bezels, the channel where I review, rant, and ramble about expensive toys for adult girls and boys. I'm Alex, and today I've got something really special to share with you. This is the Shirogorov Custom Division Neon NL. Custom Division models will have more intricate milling, nicer blade steels. This one, for example, is S110V. And use kind of more interesting materials and technologies when compared to the serialized or production models. They're not like true customs because they're not made by Sergei Shirogorov, but they are made by one craftsman or a technician or whatever you want to call it. Start to finish, one person has their hands on this knife in the factory. So that's pretty cool. All right. So yeah, enough of that. Here's the knife. I guess we'll start by getting the specs out of the way. The Neon has a blade made of S110V. Blade length is just a hair under 3.4 inches. Overall length is roughly 7 3/4 inches. The knife weighs 3.1 ounces, which is quite lightweight and falls, right under that kind of magic ratio of 1-to-1 blade inches per ounce, which kind of makes for the ideal carry size and weight in a lot of people's opinions. So, taking a bit of a closer look at the blade, we'll actually see that it's quite similar to the blade that's on the Neon Zero. For those who are familiar with that model, sort of a modified drop point shape here. Nice belly, subtle belly there. Full flat grind, nice and thin behind the edge, like all Shirogorovs are. And just like every Shirogorov, I think this would probably make a fantastic slicer. Now the finish on the blade is one that a lot of Shirogorov fans would recognize. Let me give this a quick wipe, take my fingerprints off of there. Alright, so what you see is this kind of subtle, light stone wash on top of a smooth and subtle polish on the blade. And the flats here, you can see them reflecting a little bit. These seem to have maybe a little bit of a higher polish compared to the ground portions of the blade, which gives it a little bit of a differentially finished look, maybe, or a two-tone look. I mean, it's not a differentially finished blade, right? But it has a unique sort of aesthetic to it in that way. Now, looking at the actual sort of build of the blade here. Right here you can see the reinforced tip, which tapers into this thin, straight kind of a spine, right? It's flanked by lovely swedge that starts right at the kind of corner of this diamond-shaped tip and goes all the way back to the very, very end of the blade, right where it meets the stop pin. Which is really pretty fantastic. So the spine tapers back, goes into this jimping. The jimping, I would say, is very characteristic and typical of Shirogorov. Basically, it's done very finely. The finishing is perfect, but it's also a little bit smoother and a little bit shallower than I would like, in the sense that from a usability or practicality standpoint, it may as well not be there, right? It's not exactly functional, but it is nice. So moving down, we see this custom division pivot sitting in a zirconium pivot collar, and I think you eagle-eyed viewers might notice that the show side slot is actually a lot smoother and more shallow compared to the lock side slot here. And The reason for that is that the show side pivot is captive. And the way that they executed this is ingenious. Essentially, what they do is they inset a tiny little ball bearing into the pivot collar, and then the pivot head has a corresponding indexed hole, which is like a detent hole, right? And the whole thing essentially functions like a detent in a blade, where you line them up, the pivot head drops onto the bearing, and boom, you got a captive pivot. I'm a huge fan of captive pivots, and I think in 2022, like, everybody should have one, right? And this design that Shirogorov used on this knife is so unbelievably simple. It's elegant. I love it, and it's something I would love for them to implement on their serialized or production models in the future. Again, for something this simple, I feel like it would be easy to add it to their workflow or their process, and it would be, a huge upgrade for the line in general. But honestly, all knife makers should do this. Now, another great thing about this knife that's true for, I think, the whole Neon line, is that it is constructed with just two screws. Just two screws hold this knife together. You've got the pivot screw and you've got the body screw. But there's a problem. This is a custom division knife, and because it's a custom division knife, Shirogorov decided to bless it with some silly proprietary hardware on the body screw. So this is kind of like an inverted Shirogorov screw, right? Knife makers, please stop using hardware that requires proprietary bits. Headache is totally not worth any sort of visual interest that it creates, right? Every single knife, no matter how nice it is, eventually needs to be taken apart and cleaned. Some knives need to be, oiled or greased. And knives like this, which are built to much, much higher and tighter tolerances, require more maintenance than usual, right? And it's just frustrating. But if you absolutely have to use, for whatever reason, proprietary screws, at least have the decency to provide them with the tools that this thing requires. In this case, Shirogorov doesn't provide any sort of specialized custom division screwdriver. So if you want one, you're kind of screwed. They're really tough to find. You can't just go and buy one. You can't buy one from Shirogorov. You basically have to go to the secondary market. The demand for them is pretty high. Shirogorov, for whatever reason, made far fewer custom division tools than they made custom division knives. And so these things actually tend to sell on the secondary market for, $400, $500, $600 easily, and they go fast. So yeah, if you manage to get your hands on one of these knives, then hopefully you never have to take it apart. You can see this one has a little bit of a beat up body screw, which again comes with the territory when you put these crazy proprietary hardware on stuff. People will do some interesting stuff to try to get these out. So yeah, gotta love that. But anywho, moving on to the action. Another thing that makes custom division knives unique compared to the production version is the type of bearing system that they use. So most production models from Shirogorov will come with either a single or a multi-row bearing system, and what that is basically like the kind of knife bearings you're used to seeing. Ball bearings sitting in a cage or in a washer, that kind of thing. But these are a little bit different. This knife uses a roller bearing system, which consists of cylindrical bearings that roll across a steel washer surface. And as a result, the action is actually quite different from that of production Neons that I've owned and handled in the past. So deployment on this thing is classic Shiro. It's crisp, it's fast, it's satisfying. One thing that I really love about this knife is that this carbon fiber inlay here functions almost like a lock side scale on a bolster lock, where it keeps your fingers just barely off of the lock bar, right? Which makes it a lot easier to actually deploy the knife. I know a lot of Neon owners, myself included, have had trouble kind of reliably uh, deploying the blade of those knives in the past because your fingers sort of want to rest on the lock bar. And it can be really frustrating, especially because Shirogorov is known for their actions, right? So this solves that problem, which is great. I think the real difference is in the closing action. Um, Production models tend to have kind of a free dropping blade that's very smooth, and this is not that. The custom division is more controlled. It's more kind of buttery or hydraulic, um, and it really shines, at least for me, when you're sort of slow closing it, because you can just feel that smoothness. Um, Show you a little bit better. I'm sort of blocking the view here. But yeah, if I'm being honest, I was actually a little bit disappointed when I took this knife out of the box because I was expecting essentially like an elevated version of a drop shot Shiro, and what I got was something totally different. And over time, as I've had this for a little while and played with it, I've definitely come to appreciate it for what it is. It's just not what I was expecting. So next we're going to move on to what is my favorite aspect of this knife, and that's the scales, right? So we're going to start by talking about these carbon fiber inlays, which are really gorgeous. I think when I bought this, I think I thought that these were fat carbon, and maybe they are. I'm not really sure if it's fat carbon or if it's like just some kind of crazy marbled carbon fiber or something, but this is probably the best carbon fiber that I've ever seen on a knife. Just so interesting looking, a lot of detail, a lot of visual interest. Kind of changes depending on the way the light hits it, and yeah, it's just really cool. But as cool as the carbon fiber is, it pales in comparison to the milling work that just covers every square centimeter of this knife. So I guess we'll start on kind of like the main scale surface here. You'll see these sort of wavy concentric mill lines, right? And one thing that I think is really cool is here up by the pivot, you've got these very sort of wide, broad, distinct lines. But as the milling continues down the body, it becomes much finer, skinnier. Yeah, the spacing changes, which again is just another one of these details that like separates Shirogorov and Custom Division from other makers out there. Yeah, so really beautiful, right? Now taking a look at the spine of the knife here, you'll see you got your kind of flipper finger relief cutout, which is standard. You'll see that on like pretty much every Shirogorov. But you won't see is the way that it's sort of framed and shaped by these thick, heavy bevels around the outside here. Just really, creates kind of a really interesting shape with the right lighting. Now moving back, you see that these top lines sort of start to taper down until they get to the back spacer. And the back spacer is actually notched into the scales, which is a totally unnecessary thing to do, but it's just cool. It's a great detail. Kind of going back behind the back spacer, you'll see that the scales take another turn and they start to kind of branch out in these like semicircular three-dimensional ridges, and the circle pattern basically kind of aligns with the flat portions of the backspacer here. And again, just, really beautiful. Creates these sort of angular peaks and valleys. Really gorgeous stuff. Looking at the backspacer itself, it's got this sort of geared pattern on it. And you'll notice that not only does the spacing between the teeth of the gears start to sort of get shorter or narrower, the milling pattern or the gear pattern itself tapers down as the backspacer approaches this lanyard hole area. And again, every little bit of this is chamfered and milled and pretty fantastic. Turning the knife over, you will see the way that the blade fits into the backspacer. Super nice and impressive. One really kind of fun and cool detail here is actually inside of the backspacer. Not sure if you can see this. You see kind of right here, there's another notch milled in further in the body on the backspacer. And it's cut to fit this this kind of portion of the belly of the knife, right? And the groove is there. Hardly anybody would notice this thing, I think. Although I suppose anybody who buys a knife like this probably would be shining a flashlight into it. You know, they could have just machined the inside of the backspacer to be thinner and flatter and basically have the same functionality, right? But they chose not to. Weirdly, I think that little groove kind of perfectly encapsulates like the ethos of these custom division Shirogorovs. Just astounding, incredible, unnecessary attention to detail. The lock side is arguably even more impressive than the show side. I love this pocket clip, for instance. You know, the pocket clip has got these almost organic, sort of undulating mill lines. Sorry about the focus, guys. There we go. You know, it almost looks like you ran your fingers through a block of wet clay or something. Just has this great organic feel to it. You know, you start to consider that this was made by a mill bit on titanium, and sort of boggles the mind, right? Moving on a little bit further back, I think, you know, the joy of this knife is that it's almost like architectural in its beauty. Another kind of cool thing on the lock side here is taking a look here at the lock bar insert. So a couple things here. First, I love that it has this sort of a widened milling around this flat spot, which goes back to that kind of organic feel on the pocket clip. But the thing that really stood out to me is the way that they handle the lock bar insert. Now, on most knives, the head of the screw that holds the lock bar insert on will be on the outside, screw head on the inside. Shirogorov decided to do it the other way. You've got a real Shirogorov slotted screw head on the inside, and then the tip on the outside. And that by itself is kind of cool, kind of extra, right? But the really great thing about this is that they went and they polished the head of the screw in like a beautiful radial polishing pattern that just looks incredible. And yeah, so you get this little cherry on top, a beautiful screw head that is there for really no reason other than to show attention to detail and you know, manufacturing excellence. The scales are truly skeletonized, and so you can actually see the carbon fiber in there. Just basically what makes this knife as light as it is, right? Kind of cool. But yeah, I think I've been rambling for a while now, but before I wrap it up, I do want to talk about one more thing, and that's value, right? So obviously the kind of idea of value in knife collecting is extremely subjective. And I think most collectors probably are grading on a curve when it comes to value. I know I certainly do. But the prices for these in particular are pretty wild. Table price on this knife was somewhere between like 15 and 1700 bucks, which is crazy, but in a sense, I kind of get it. Like the precision and the tolerances, and the insane complexity of the milling, the perfection of this hand ground blade, all that fun stuff. Um, it's expensive, you know. It takes skill, it takes knowledge, it takes high end equipment, it takes highly skilled labor, putting in a lot of hours. So I get it. And I think if you're the kind of person that spends $1,500 on a knife, I think you'd be extremely pleased for what you got for your money. Um, but the secondary market for these things is even crazier. These go anywhere between like 2,500 and 3,000. Again, depending on the configuration and the rarity of the specific custom division neon or whatever custom division piece you're looking at. And that price point is tough to swallow, at least for me. You know, for 2,500, 3,000 bucks, you can easily get two or three really nice custom knives from other makers, South African makers, American makers, whatever. And ultimately, that's why this one isn't a keeper for me. I've traded it away. It's going to another home tomorrow. This knife is like a work of art. You can spend hours staring at it, finding new details to admire and to drool over. Um, it's amazing, right? And I'm sad to see it go. I'm sure that I'm gonna miss it, but at the end of the day, I don't think I'll regret it. Yeah, you know, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this design, on Shirogorov, on the value prop that high-end knives in general represent. So please leave a comment down below. I'd love to hear from you. Yeah, that's all, folks. Join me next time on Blades and Bezels for more cool knives, watches, other fun stuff. Peace.